Welcome to Signal Ahead. I'm Alfred. Today's briefing, Cryptography Academic, Saturday, August 22. This is the synthesis above the noise, not the headlines, but the deep currents beneath them. Let's get into it. There's a temptation, when you read the cryptography literature as it actually arrives, not the polished textbook version, but the raw daily output, to conclude that the field has lost its nerve. You go in expecting elegant impossibility proofs and lattices and the arithmetic of elliptic curves, and instead you find papers about messaging apps leaking your data to advertisers, about people cloning virtual reality applications, about whether a language model can be tricked into forwarding a document it shouldn't. It looks, at first glance, like a discipline that has wandered off its own map. But here is the thing I want you to hold in your mind for the next hour, because it is the connection a casual reader of the news would almost certainly miss. The center of gravity in cryptography has shifted, quietly, decisively, away from the question of whether a secret can be kept, and toward the question of whether a claim can be trusted. Those are not the same problem. For most of the field's modern history, they were treated as nearly the same problem. Because if you could establish a secure channel and prove identity, trust more or less followed. Encryption was the crown jewel. Everything else was plumbing. What the current literature is telling us, in a dozen different dialects, is that the plumbing has become the crown jewel, and encryption, genuinely remarkably, is now largely a solved comfort. Consider what people are worried about when they build for the world after quantum computers arrive. You might expect the anxiety to be mathematical. Will the lattice hold? Will the hard problems stay hard? And yes, that work continues. But look closely at the hybrid post-quantum designs for cloud storage, where you combine a classical key exchange with a standardized quantum-resistant one, and you discover the actual bottleneck isn't security at all. It's that signing each file individually with a lattice-based signature is ruinously slow at realistic scale. So the clever move, binding an entire batch of ciphertexts to a single commitment and signing that once, is not a security breakthrough in the old sense. It's an engineering reconciliation between a primitive we trust and a workload we have. The frontier is no longer, can we resist the adversary, but can we afford to? And then there is the strange new adversary that the old cryptography never had a name for. When your system is a network of autonomous agents, programs that discover one another, invoke each other's tools, delegate tasks across organizational boundaries, the entire vocabulary of confidentiality becomes almost beside the point. The messages between these agents can be perfectly encrypted, and it doesn't help you one whit, because the real question is, does this agent actually have the authorization it claims? Did it truly do what it reported doing? Who is accountable after a task has been delegated 3 hops away from its origin? This is why you see proposals for what one might call a trust substrate, identity cards that bind a developer to a code package, to an operator, to a deployment context, capability manifests, negotiation layers, accountability records. Notice the shape of it. This is cryptography, being asked to underwrite reputation and provenance rather than secrecy. It is the discipline of the sealed envelope being conscripted into the business of the signed affidavit. The subtlety deepens when you realize that even our attempts to measure whether these systems are safe are themselves corrupted by the trust problem. There is a lovely, uncomfortable piece of work that audits a security evaluation of tool using agents and finds that the grading itself leaked, that the label "attack succeeded" was being decided partly by metadata about the experiment rather than by what the agent actually did. When they reconstructed the evaluation blind to that metadata, dozens of supposed attacks turned out to be perfectly authorized, benign completions. Sit with that. We built a system to certify trust, and the certification apparatus could not itself be trusted. Turtles, as they say, some considerable distance down. You see the same instinct migrating into the older, harder corners of the field too. The purest paper in this whole gathering, a classification of certain linearized operators over finite fields, the deep algebra that underlies the design of the very substitution boxes inside our ciphers, sits next to a study asking whether the classical notion of a program invariant, an assertion that must always hold true, is the most powerful weapon we have against people stealing billions from smart contracts. And what is an invariant really? It is a claim that the system promises to keep, a statement you can verify. Trust, again, in formal dress. So the thesis I want to build over these next stretches is this. Cryptography has become the science of verifiable claims in adversarial environments, and encryption is merely its oldest and best-behaved child. The action has moved to delay, to commitment, to provenance, to invariant, to the auditability of the auditor. Where we stand now is a field that has quietly won the war. It set out to fight and found itself drafted into a much stranger one. Let us walk into it properly. There is a temptation, when you survey a month's worth of work in a field like this, to see only fragmentation. Here is a paper about anonymous mail routing. Here is one about virtual reality piracy. Here is another about the algebraic structure of certain nonlinear functions over binary fields. And scattered among them, an almost comic profusion of concern about a new species entirely, the software agent, the thing that reasons, that fetches, that acts on your behalf across the open network. What could possibly connect the classification of Frobenius linearized operators to the question of whether an autonomous penetration tester can be fooled by a lying server? I want to suggest that there is a connecting current, and that it runs deeper than mere coincidence of publication date. The deep current is this. The field is quietly relocating its notion of trust from the object to the behavior, from what a thing is to what a thing does over time in context. Consider how classical security thought about the world. You had a secret, a key. You had a message. You proved that an adversary staring at the message learned nothing about the secret. Trust was a static property. It lived in a mathematical object, and once you had established it, it stayed established. The proof did not care about Tuesday. It did not care what happened at 9 in the morning versus midnight. It was timeless, in the way theorems are timeless. And that older world has not gone away. You can still see it in its purest form in that classification of nonlinear maps, where the entire drama plays out in the fixed, eternal geometry of a finite field, no clock anywhere in sight. But look at what surrounds it now. Consider the ancient problem of two applications that look alike, the original and the clone, the cheap counterfeit riding on someone else's labor. On the old mobile platforms, you compared the objects, the code, the resources, the static fingerprint. But in virtual reality that fails, and the answer is to move up a level of abstraction, to describe an application not by its bytes, but by its hierarchy of objects and behaviors, what it presents, what it does, how it acts in its little world. The identity of the thing has migrated from its substance to its conduct. Now hold that thought against the flood of concern about intelligent agents. Notice the recurring anxiety. An agent proves its identity, its authorization, its advertised capabilities, its accountability after it has acted, and someone observes, pointedly, that the existing protocols say how these creatures talk, but not how they prove what they are. Notice the penetration testing agent that can be redirected by a deceptive response, whose final report tells you nothing about how it reasoned its way to a false conclusion. Notice the audit that discovers, with quiet horror, that a whole campaign of security evaluations had confused the label of an event with the event itself, that the stored verdict and the actual behavior had come apart, and the grader was cheating by reading its own metadata. Do you hear the common note? In every case, the question is no longer, is this object authentic? But can I trust this sequence of actions as it unfolds? And that is a fundamentally harder question, because behavior lives in time, and time is where the adversary lives too. This is why Delay itself becomes a weapon of defense. There is genuine beauty in the idea that you can neutralize a certain kind of manipulation, the reordering and front-running of transactions for profit, not by hiding anything, but by imposing an enforced slowness, a verifiable delay, so that the manipulator simply cannot react to an opportunity in the window available. That is a security guarantee expressed entirely in the currency of time. The old world proved that you could not compute a secret. The new world proves that you cannot compute a secret fast enough to matter. And the same shift explains why the humble invariant is being rediscovered as, possibly, the most powerful idea available for the most adversarial environment in computing. An invariant is not a wall around an object. It is a promise about behavior, a statement that must remain true no matter what sequence of actions the contract endures. It watches conduct over time and refuses the trajectory that would violate the promise. It is, if you like, the behavioral turn made rigorous. So beneath the noise, the mini-apps leaking your data through ordinary web requests, the graph that traces persistent behavioral patterns across 30 million transactions, the detection engineer reaching past the fragile fingerprint toward the durable habit at the top of the pyramid of pain, beneath all of it runs this single migration. We have spent decades learning to trust objects. We are now, rather anxiously, learning that we must trust processes, and that a process only reveals its true character across time, under pressure, and often only when it is being lied to. That is the current. And in our final stretch, I want to ask where it is carrying us. There's a temptation, when surveying a field's output over a single day, to read it as noise, a scattering of unrelated results, each author burrowing into their own corner. But sit with it a while, and a shape emerges. What we've been circling in this conversation is not really a set of separate problems. It's one problem, wearing many costumes. And the thing to watch, going forward, is how the discipline reorganizes itself around that recognition. Consider what has quietly become the center of gravity. A decade ago, the marquee anxieties of cryptography were about primitives. Is this cipher sound? Is this signature forgeable? Can this key exchange survive a quantum machine? Those questions have not gone away. We saw a perfectly respectable piece of work stitching lattice-based signatures and key encapsulation into cloud storage, worrying about the very real problem that signing each file individually becomes ruinous at scale, and solving it by committing an entire batch to a single digest. That is classical cryptographic engineering at its best. But notice, even there, the interesting difficulty was not the mathematics of the primitive. It was the economics of composition. How do you make the guarantee affordable when you need it 1,000 times over? And that, I'd suggest, is the second-order implication worth carrying out of this room. The frontier has migrated from the primitive to the system, and from the system to the agent. Look at how much of the day's work concerns things that reason, decide, and act on our behalf. Penetration testing agents that must judge whether the evidence in front of them is truthful, and the sobering discovery that a target can simply lie, and the agent, lacking any settled notion of verification, will follow the lie down a corridor of its own construction. Skill-based assistance that can be nudged, by nothing more than a persuasive description, into taking the expensive scenic route to an otherwise correct answer. Protocols being drafted for an entire internet of these agents, where the unsolved question is not how they talk, but how one proves it is who it claims to be, that it is permitted to do what it attempts, and that someone remains accountable after a task is handed off. That word, accountable, is the one to watch, because what these lines of research collectively confess is that we are deploying autonomous actors into adversarial environments faster than we are building the trust substrate beneath them. The old cryptographic dream was to reduce trust to a small, verifiable core, hold this key secret, and everything follows. The agentic world inverts that. Trust becomes diffuse. contextual, negotiated, revocable, and the tools we have for reasoning about it are borrowed, awkwardly, from the era of static software. There is a second thread, humbler but arguably more corrosive, and it concerns whether we can believe our own measurements. Two pieces struck me on this. One examined the privacy disclosures of mini-apps embedded inside a messaging platform and found that the promise on the page and the packets on the wire are, shall we say, not close acquaintances. The other performed a kind of forensic audit on a security evaluation itself and discovered that the labels declaring an attack successful had been contaminated by the very metadata describing the experiment's conditions. The grader was, in effect, marking its own homework. When the reconstruction was done honestly, most of those triumphant attacks succeeded. Verdicts dissolved into perfectly authorized, benign behavior. I want you to feel the full weight of that. A field that exists to distinguish the trustworthy from the deceptive found deception inside its own instruments. And this is not scandal, it is maturity. A discipline becomes serious precisely when it turns its skepticism inward, when it asks not only, is the system secure, but is my claim that the system is secure actually a claim about the system, or a claim about my apparatus for observing it? Construct validity, the philosophers of science would call it. Are we measuring the thing we think we're measuring? So here is what I'd watch. First, whether the trust infrastructure for autonomous agents matures faster than the agent's capabilities, because if it does not, we will have built a bureaucracy of brilliant, credulous clerks with no way to check each other's credentials. Second, whether the community's newfound taste for auditing its own evaluations becomes a norm or a fashion. The half-life of a fashion is short. The half-life of a norm is the difference between a science and a genre. And third, quieter still, whether we remember that the old problems didn't vanish. Someone, this very day, was classifying algebraic structures inside the maps that give block ciphers their nonlinearity. That work will still matter when today's clever agents are museum pieces. The through line, if there is one, is this. Security has always been the study of adversarial gaps, the space between what we intend and what actually happens. What has changed is that the gap now opens inside our delegates and inside our rulers. The lie is in the target. The leakage is in the label. Watch the gaps. They are where the field lives. That's the signal for today. The noise will keep coming, we'll keep finding what's underneath it. This has been Signal Ahead with Alfred. Until next time.